The next most back place of articulation is often referred to as dorsal. This is because sounds produced at these places of articulation are made with further back parts of the tongue. Just as a shark's dorsal fin is on the shark's back, dorsal sounds are produced with the dorsal or back part of the tongue. There are two main places of articulation usually recognized as dorsal. The first of these is palatal. As the name implies, palatal sounds are produced with the main obstruction at the hard palate. This is a broad area with lots of different points at which the tongue could make contact. It turns out that English doesn't produce many sounds at the palatal place of articulation at all. In fact, only one sound is consistently recognized as palatal. This is the sound y, as in yes. There are researchers and writers who will refer to some other sounds as being palatal, including the sound in right, and sometimes even the sounds like sh and ch, as in ship and chip, which we earlier described as postalveolar or alveopalatal. Particularly in the field of linguistics, this set of sounds is often referred to as palatal as a form of shorthand. At times, these differences in how people refer to particular sounds can get a bit confusing, and it's important to remember that all of these different people are talking about the same sounds, and the differences really relate not to the sounds themselves, but rather to the role that these sounds play within the larger context of the English speech sound system. In other words, they're phonological differences, not phonetic differences. The next most back place of articulation, which is also considered a dorsal place, is the velar place of articulation. As this name suggests, velar sounds are produced with a main obstruction at the velum. You'll recall that the velum also goes by the name soft palate. These two terms are interchangeable, and you should know both of them. For velar sounds, the back of the tongue moves up to make contact with the velum, and the sounds that result include the first sound in key, the first sound in goose, and the final sound in ring. Now notice that the symbol we use for the sound in the word ring looks a little like an N with a tail like the letter G. However, it's one symbol, while you'll recognize that it represents a sound that is often spelled with two letters, N and G. This goes back to the principle we discussed earlier, that the phonetic alphabet wants to have one symbol to represent each individual sound. Because there's only one consonant sound at the end of the word ring, we want to have one symbol that's reserved for representing this sound, and this sound only. Since there wasn't already a symbol that represented this sound, they made one up. Engma is an amalgam symbol made up of a combination of parts of N and parts of G, in order to represent that this sound shares characteristics with the sounds N and G. What it shares with G is that both Engma and G are produced at the velar place of articulation. We'll cover the similarity with N in another movie. The final place of articulation that we'll talk about for English is glottal. This is the only place that's not pictured on this diagram. This is because the diagram doesn't go quite far enough down. Just below the end here is the larynx, and within the larynx, you'll remember, are the vocal folds. You'll also remember that the vocal folds might be open, in which case air can pass through pretty easily. Of course, the vocal folds can be open to different degrees, so at times there might be more space between them, and at other times there might be less space between them. The space between the vocal folds is called the glottis, and it's this word that gives rise to the term glottal consonants. As indicated, these consonants have the most obstruction at the level of the vocal folds. If the vocal folds are open a little bit, then air will rush through the narrow opening, creating a slightly hissy sound like at the beginning of the word hot. Of course, the vocal folds can also be closed, and if this happens, then all of the airflow through the glottis might stop for a brief period. If this happens, the sound that's produced is referred to as a glottal stop. This sound has an interesting role in English, and it's the only one of the consonants we've discussed in this section that isn't usually recognized as a separate phoneme in English. In fact, there are fairly few words that use the glottal stop all the time. One of these is the word uh-oh. Try saying this word and notice how there's a brief silence between the two syllables. Try holding that silence out for a few seconds and see if you can feel where in your mouth you're straining to keep the silence going. You should feel some tension in the middle of your throat. That's about where the glottis is, and what you're doing is keeping your vocal folds completely closed so that all airflow stops until you start the second syllable. We use this symbol to represent the glottal stop. It looks a little like a question mark, but notice that it isn't actually a question mark. There's no dot underneath. In fact, some people put a small base at the bottom of the glottal stop, like this, to make it look more clear that this isn't a question mark. As we'll see later, glottal stops play an interesting role in English speech production. So even though it isn't usually thought of as a phoneme itself, it's an especially important sound and symbol to learn. This concludes the introduction to the main categories of place of articulation for consonants. In the next section, we'll look at the second important way to classify consonants.